good. Hey, look what I just found.
Oh.
Been missing. I was like, where did I leave it? It's right in the pocket.
Yeah, mine is somewhere too.
Yeah.
I'll make an announcement to see if we need any translation as well.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you for doing that.
Ricardo, I see Lucero, and Lucero I know for sure needs translation. I think she's a lady from last time.
Sounds good.
Okay,
I can
perfect.
jump into the interpretation channel whenever you need.
There's Spanish.
Maybe, Lizette, you could do an announcement about that, just to remind people.
Vamos a empezar la junta y veo que déjenme saber si ocupan traducción. Aquí tenemos a Ricardo, que va a hacer traducción esta tarde. Okay. Please let us know if you need any translation. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready. All right, well, those of you who are listed as attendees here, I hope you can hear us and see us. And, maybe just to check, could some of you try raising your hands just so we can make sure everyone's on with us? There we go. Thank you, folks, for raising your hands. Okay, so my name's John Alden, and I'm going to introduce you to a couple people here. I'm the director of IOLERO, and this is our first ever town hall chat about one of our annual reports. Several people had suggested we try this out this year, and so it's a little bit of an experiment, so bear with us as we try this out, and you can give us some feedback at the end about whether this worked for you or whether we might do it differently or better in future. So with us tonight, we have Lizette Camacho, who you just heard from. She does all of our outreach here at IOLERO, and then she also staffs the Community Advisory Council, which does a lot of work with the Sheriff's Office about developing new policy and other recommendations. Also with us tonight is Matt Chavez, who's one of our auditors. He's been with us for about 1.5 years now, I think, right, Matt?
Yes.
Yep. And so he does a lot of the auditing work that you see in our report. Lizette does a lot of the outreach and public facing work that you also see in the report. And then we also have, as Lizette was mentioning earlier, we have here Ricardo Ibarra. Ricardo is, he has many hats. And he also has some very nice looking hats, I have to say. Ricardo, I like your hats. So Ricardo has done a couple things for us. One is a lot of the graphic design that you see tonight, virtually all of it is from Ricardo and his shop, Watsa Lab. And then he's also kindly stepping in to do some translation tonight for folks who need that. Ricardo also, you'll sometimes meet him at our outreach events, taking some pictures and saying hello to some folks because he's also an excellent photographer. So we're happy to have his services, and once you see in the future some hard copies of this report, you'll know that layout work is from Ricardo and his shop. So thank you, Ricardo, for being here tonight and for your help with this annual report. So I'm going to share a screen here so you all can see some of the material that we're covering in the annual report. And also, I'm going to have a PowerPoint that we'll go through tonight that some of you might have seen parts of before. It's an expanded version of the same PowerPoint that we gave at the Board of Supervisors recently, but it's got more detail, and we're going to take breaks along the way and do some questions. So let me put that up first. Okay, so you should see our PowerPoint. Going through tonight's presentation. All right, and if you are Zoom fluent, you'll be able to put all of us who are speaking over on the right side are all on the top of your screen as we're going through. So this is the cover of our annual report, and I'm going to talk first about some of our ground rules for how we want to structure this conversation tonight. As I mentioned earlier, we haven't done this before, so this is a bit of an experiment. Hopefully this works for everybody involved. There are a few things I want to point out about how we're doing this that are, I think, important for legal reasons. One of them is that this is not a meeting of the Community Advisory Council. I think there are one or two CAC members that happen to be here at the meeting, but this is not a meeting of that group. And for that reason, the Brown Act doesn't apply here. And one reason why we like that is that, well, one, we're not making any decisions here. We're just sharing information about the annual report. Two, it enables us to have more back and forth with the community and have a slightly freer style of communicating with you. When we have meetings of the CAC and the Brown Act applies, there's a stricter format for how the community can engage with us. And we wanted to try to be free of some of those strictures and have a more flowing kind of conversation with you. That said, we do ask everyone to respect the same rules of civility that we would see at any other public meeting. So if we do have people that, choose to use racist or hurtful language or speak to others in a discourteous way, we might have to cut them out of the meeting. I'm sure no one here is going to do that, but I mentioned that so that we all have the same set of expectations at the beginning. We recommend, as you're watching this report, that you follow along with the annual report, which is available online at our website. You don't have to, but we're going to go through the material here in largely the same order that you see it in the annual report, so you might find that helpful. If you have a question, you're welcome to throw it into the chat at any time, and we will do our best during question breaks to get back to those questions and make sure we've covered them. We have a fair number of people on this call. Looks like we're over 25 participants. So we are going to ask that people use the chat to ask questions, only because we figure there's going to be a number of questions that we'll probably repeat. And we want to make sure that we're moving through this material fairly quickly, because we're shooting for about a 2-hour meeting, and we find past that people do start tuning out. So we're going to have Lizette and Matthew and I are all going to comb through the questions as they come in on the chat. Feel free to post them at any time that's convenient for you. Now, in addition to that, we've got some periodic pauses that we'll take to solicit questions. So you'll have moments where we'll invite you to add things to the chat if you haven't already. One of the rules that is going to apply here is that we can't give you super detailed information about some of the audits that we did. And that's because there's a California Penal Code section 832.7 that in most of the time prevents us from doing that. So if you have questions like, well, can you give us a more specific address about where this happened? Or can you give us the name of the deputies involved? Or can you give us a date for these incidents? We cannot answer those questions. So there are a couple cases that are exceptions, but in an abundance of caution, we have put all the material that we can share about those cases up on our website. And so for the purposes of this conversation tonight, we're going to stick to the rule that applies to almost all the cases, which is no names, no identifying information like locations or dates. So I know that is somewhat frustrating to the public. I find that frustrating as well, but that is just the state of California law right now. At the end of this, we would love to get feedback from all of you about how we could do this differently in the future, or how it might be modified to better suit the community's needs. So please do feel free to give us some feedback at the end, or reach out to us after this is over. With that said, let me dive into a quick roadmap about the report, and then we'll pause for a couple of questions as we start digging through some of the material. Okay, so our report this year follows a format that's similar to prior years. We've got a table of contents, an executive summary from me, a message from our Community Advisory Council, the chair and vice chair, Lorena Barrera and Nancy Pemberton, have a message in there. Then there's a section with an update about Measure P, which we've talked about a lot in the public over the last year, a section about our budget and staffing. There's another section about outreach. Lizette and I will talk in a little more detail about that tonight. And then the longest section of the report is about the complaints and the audits that we've looked at. And what trends we saw in those complaints and audits. So that'll be the lion's share of our conversation tonight. And again, there'll be lots of pauses in there for questions. So a quick overview, the things that we think are important about this report or that are potentially meaningful to the community are that in this last year, by the end of the fiscal year, June 2023, IOLERO was finally fully staffed. And at least in the last few years, that's the only time it's been fully staffed, the first time it's been fully staffed. And we're really excited about that because it means we're better able to execute on the community's vision for IOLERO as expressed in Measure P. We initiated some new projects in this last year to implement Measure P. We'll talk about some of those as we're working through this report. We significantly increased our outreach efforts this last year. COVID ending was a big part of that, but Lizette coming on about a year ago, just a little after the fiscal year started, was a big part of that. And then we also are trying to get our annual reports to dovetail with the county's fiscal year, meaning basically July of one year till June the following calendar year. That aligns with the annual report we see from the sheriff's office and annual reports we see from a lot of other agencies here. And we just want to be in the habit of getting those out routinely every year. So we're going to make that a continuing deadline for us, is to try to match the fiscal year. Another significant part of the report here is that you'll see that we received 53 different complaints that we then forwarded over to the sheriff's office this past fiscal year. And then we had 27 cases that were returned from the sheriff's office with completed investigations back to IOLERO to audit. And those numbers are important because they're both pretty significant compared to prior years. So we know our caseload's going up. I'll talk briefly about Measure P and about staffing, and then we'll take a quick pause for some questions. So this last year, we had some significant progress with regards to Measure P, the measure that the voters of Sonoma County passed back in 2020 by a really wide margin, empowering IOLERO to do the work you're going to hear about tonight, and also ensuring that we have adequate funding to do that. So that material reconfirms that we have direct access to a number of sheriff's office records, especially body-worn camera, that we have a subpoena power, that we can do independent investigations in certain kinds of cases, that we can make recommendations regarding discipline, that we can investigate certain whistleblower complaints. There were a set of letters of agreement, meaning agreements with the applicable unions that are affected by these new powers, in June of 2022, just before this reporting period, that reconfirmed those powers. There was some concern in the public that some of the letters of agreement either read in ways that seemed counterintuitive, as if they were opposite to Measure P, or that had just a wholly different idea than you see in Measure P. So we spent some time over the course of this last year amending those letters of agreement. We were done with that in May of 2023. And the big change that we see in those amendments in 2023 is that it now allows IOLERO and the sheriff's office to concurrently, at the same time, investigate some of the independent investigations that we were supposed to do under Measure P. Those are mostly cases in which somebody has died, either because of use of force by folks at the sheriff's office, or because they died in custody, like in the jail, for example. So we're glad that we got that agreement together. Our Community Advisory Council, I know, had some real concerns in the summer of 2022 about the first set of letters. And so we think we did a pretty good job of responding to some of those concerns over the course of the year. As for budget and staffing, our budget pursuant to Measure P is 1% of the sheriff's office budget. This last fiscal year, that was just over $2 million. As I mentioned, Lizette Camacho came on in 2022, and she's here. I think actually that should be September, right? Lizette? Yep, sorry about that. September of 2022 is when she came on. We have a new full-time auditor, a part-time auditor, and a full-time administrative coordinator that all got hired at the end of last year. The one auditor we had before that is Matt Chavez, who I introduced earlier, who's on this call. And so you'll see, a lot of the audits here were ones that he worked on, and that's one reason he graciously agreed to be on the call. So he might be able to answer some additional questions if they're of the sort we can answer. Sometimes people ask about the demographics of the sheriff's office, and so we thought it was only fair to provide our own demographics. Our office is, and I'm careful here not to identify individuals because that's generally considered inappropriate in county government, but we do share generalized demographic data. And if you look at our full-time staff, we're half Latino and half white, and also half male, half female in our staff. If you include some of the part-time employees we have, we're about half white, 12.5% Asian, 37.5% Latino, and slightly more female than male, 63.5% female staff, if you include the part-time folks. Some folks ask us about the training for our auditors. They're all attorneys. We now have 2 full-time auditors and 1 part-time auditor, all of them attorneys. And so in the course of their training as attorneys, they received quite a bit of training about the core laws about use of force, which I think is especially appropriate given the kinds of auditing work that we're doing. They come from a variety of past experiences. Several of them have done some local legal work already in Sonoma County. In fact, 3 of the 4 of us have, and we include me. About half of our staff have legal staff have some kind of legal aid experience. Just coincidentally, that seems to have been a common origin. About half of us have some prior law enforcement oversight experience. Some of us have some prior auditing experience in other fields. And all of us have some kind of experience in investigations and interview skills based on our previous work as attorneys. We continue to do training with everybody in the office. Some of that's because we all have to have a license to practice law, but some of that, and that requires continuing training, but we also go to some core training that you see in both the law enforcement community and in the oversight of law enforcement community, including the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. We'll all be going to that in November. We also attend some of the same training where we run into some of the people from the sheriff's office, like Americans for Effective Law Enforcement. Matt and I went to a training that group offered back in January about jails, and we're pleased to see someone there from the sheriff's office and got to talk to them, got to experience the same training together. I think that's useful. And we also have access to some of the training that the sheriff's office provides to its own employees, like their force simulator. So before I go on to our next section, why don't we take a quick peek and see if we have some questions we might be able to answer. One of them is, are there slides with this info? So I'm wondering if everyone can see the slides as I'm going through them, because they're showing up on my end.
We can only see the first slide, John.
All right. Well, interesting. All right. Give me a minute and I'll see if I can fix that.
Oh, are you able to just hit enter or the arrow to go to the next slide? Maybe.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right. No, that's a screen share fail. So sorry about that. This was the last slide that I had up. So can everyone see the one that says IOLERO auditor training?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
There is a comment from Jim Duffy.
Yes.
You see it?
Yep, I got it. Jim, you've mentioned that to me before. If we have that in a future report, I'll get it in there. And Robin, you're asking, yes, depending on how you choose to set your Zoom settings, you might be able to see the speakers or everyone. So it depends on how you set Zoom. Since those seem to be the questions that we have, let me go to our next slide. You should be able to see one that says IOLERO Outreach. Am I getting it right this time?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is one that Lizette and I are both going to present about. We do a variety of different kinds of outreach, and we do a lot of that with members of the Community Advisory Council. And I particularly want to call out in a positive way Nancy Pemberton and Tom Rose, who have probably shown up at more of our outreach events than any of the other CAC members. They've all shown up at events, but those 2 in particular have really been fantastic about showing up. And Lisette is our lead staffer for that purpose. She and I were sitting down, last fall after we had both been here for just a little bit and thought, well, what is it that we really, want to be able to do? And one of the things that we thought we really ought to do is get back in the habit of being out in the community doing tabling, which was a big part of IOLERO's outreach prior to COVID. And this last year with COVID going not away, but getting to a place where it's easier to manage day-to-day life, and we saw a lot of our regular events coming back the way they had prior to COVID. We got out there and tried to hit all the same kinds of events that we knew from some of our records here at IOLERO we had attended as an organization prior to COVID. So Lisette found a bunch of new ones as well. So we've been really emphasizing getting out into the community and doing Q&A in person, one-on-one. You might call it retail, right? Lisette found some great opportunities to do some radio ads and PSAs that were in Spanish, so we can reach out more to the Spanish-speaking community. And between those ads and then the work that we were doing out in the field, we did get some feedback that a lot of people in that community are concerned about retribution for reporting misconduct. So like coming forward and reporting, things that they were worried about was anxiety producing. And so we've done a couple things to try to improve that. We've created a Spanish version of our website. So one can go straight to an entirely Spanish version of the website. And then we also made sure to make the points both in English and Spanish about the ability to make complaints anonymously a little clearer so that people feel more encouraged to do that. This next year, we're going to try to reach out in broader ways where we're hitting more people at a time, either through social media and speaking engagements and the like, where we're hitting larger numbers of people than we do just with the retail work. We'll keep doing that too, but that hopefully you'll start seeing us even more in the community than you have before. And Lisette, I love your enthusiasm about this kind of work, and I'm wondering if there's some other things you might want to add or say about how the outreach has been going and what you've enjoyed about it.
It's been going great. I try to keep myself busy. I know our mission is to do minimum one event per month, but there's some months where I do more than one event, which is great. I know this month we're going to be at Los 100 tomorrow at the mental health event, Becoming Independent. And then Saturday we are at the Community Heroes at the Boys and Girls Club. And Sunday we're going to be attending the memorial for Andy Lopez. So there's events that we are posting on our social media. So that's where you can find out what we're doing and what events we're attending, as well as our newsletter that just went out. This is also the time of the year when it kind of gets a little slow for the events, but it always picks up at the beginning of the year. So I'm looking forward to doing more events. Thank you.
Cool. Any questions? I don't see any yet in the Q&A bin on outreach. Yeah. Okay. Well, if anyone out there in the public comes across some opportunities for us to do some outreach in the future, we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with me or Lisette, or just give us a ring or an email. One of our rules of thumb has been pretty much anytime we're invited to speak somewhere, we'll make sure we show up. But we're always interested in finding new places to spread the message. So to be in touch.
I forgot to mention, I will be on KBBF tomorrow.
Yes.
I don't know if it's live, but I have an interview at 4:00.
That's great.
So
I love it.
yes.
All right. So the next set of materials, you should see a slide that says complaints and audits. So this is, I think, an important set of statistics we're going to go through in the next few slides, so you have an understanding of the size of the work that we're doing or the quantity of the work that we're doing. So we got 53 complaints from the public regarding the sheriff's office in this last fiscal year. Now, I mention it that way about the sheriff's office because we also received a lot of other complaints about other agencies, other policing agencies, California Highway Patrol, the county probation department, which we do not have oversight function over, the Santa Rosa Police Department, or other police departments in Sonoma County. Now, because we don't have the ability to accept complaints about those other agencies, we would refer those complaints over to those other agencies. And in that regard, there are a lot more complaints than just those 53 that you see in a given year. Historically, we have not tracked the number of complaints we get about other agencies that we then pass over to those other agencies. But I think in the future, we're going to see if we can't create a mechanism for doing that, because we've had a number of questions about that. I think it might be helpful to show people how often we're referring people to other places. Now, in this last year, we didn't necessarily get all those complaints back from the sheriff's office. Once we get the complaint, we give it to the sheriff's office. They do an investigation. We'll talk in a little more detail about that in a minute. And then they send us completed investigations back. This last year, we got 27 investigations back. And it's important to note, too, that some of those investigations were not even about complaints that came in. They were about other incidents that IOLERO is supposed to audit other than just complaints. That's not our only source of work. So when we look at 53 complaints that came through this last year and then 27 investigations that came back to us at IOLERO, it's pretty sure bet that in this next fiscal year, the one we're in right now, we're going to receive back a lot more administrative investigations to audit than we did last year. So our workload is consistently increasing and significantly so. Some have asked, well, why is that? We don't know. I can't point to any one reason why. In this field, it is often difficult to know why those numbers change over time. But we can say that, we know for sure that there are enough cases in the pipeline coming to us that our caseload is really going to be higher this fiscal year. So it's really fortunate that at the end of last fiscal year, in June of 2023, we were able to bring on, 1.5, as they say in HR speak, auditors. That is one full-time and one part-time auditor, because we're going to need that extra help. Of the kinds of cases that we get, there are a wide variety. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you could describe the kinds of allegations that come through. Any given case or complaint we get might have multiple allegations, right? Someone might say, hey, 2 officers were both rude to me. Well, that's 2 separate allegations, one about each officer or deputy. Or they might say, well, they're rude to me and they didn't investigate the crime I was complaining about, right? So those end up being, again, multiple allegations from one complaint. So when we are slicing up the allegations here, keep in mind there are a lot more allegations than complaints. And one of the things that we noticed is that roughly a quarter of all the allegations we get are about use of force. Now, the pie chart we've put together here are the allegations as they're described by the complainant. So this is not a representation of how often any particular kind of misconduct actually occurred or that we could prove occurred. It is, on the other hand, a description of what people in the public were complaining about, what they thought was inappropriate. So it gives you a sense of community concern. And the fact that a quarter of the complaints were about the alleged excessive use of force, I think tells us that that's a big concern for the community. The others were of a wide variety. Only about 10% were about discourtesy. In my experience, that's a relatively low number compared to some other jurisdictions. And I think that's actually, that could be a positive. It's hard to say. We'd want to see how that changes over time. And I think how it changes over time would be a more important indicator, as well as how many of those are found to have actually be sustainable, right? The others are of a wide variety. So we see amongst the complaints a lot of diverse kinds of complaints, but excessive use of force almost more than anything else. This other darker colored pie chart or pie wedge you see in the upper right refers to conduct unbecoming of a deputy, which is for lack of a better term, a generic reference to the conduct that we don't have a better term for, right? So you might call that miscellaneous or other. I'm going to pause for a second here because we just went through a lot of data and take a quick peek at some of the questions. Some of the questions that I'm seeing here are questions that we're going to hit in some of the later material. So I'm going to pause on a couple of them. One of them I see Kim Clement. Hi, Kim. You have asked what percentage of complaints were from people of color. And, you know, I don't know that we tracked that this past year, but that's a great question that I think, could track in future years. So I'm going to make a note of that so we can start doing that in the future. Let me move on to this next part about our audit processes. And Matt, you might have some thoughts to add here when we go through this next slide. So as for the process that we're using here to look at these cases, I think it's important that people understand what IOLERO does and does not do. We have under Measure P been given the ability to directly investigate certain kinds of cases, actually gather evidence or interview some deputies. We only have a small number of such cases, and none of them are in this report because none of them resolved in that fiscal year. So in this next annual report, you'll see what some of our direct investigations look like and how those resolved. But we don't have any for this report yet because they're still being worked on. So in this report, all you see are audits. And that's a style of work that IOLERO has been doing since 2016. So for those of you who have been following IOLERO for a while, this is a very similar process to what you've seen in previous annual reports. And for an audit, what this means is we have a case that the Internal Affairs Division at the Sheriff's Office investigated, where they did the interviews and gathered the evidence and put it together. That said, the source of those investigations varies a lot. Some of them are from complaints. We've noted here in the slide that 19 in this past year started with a complaint from a member of the public. But 3 of them in this past year that we looked at came from what's called an administrative review. That means the sheriff's office saw that something occurred that was of a significant impact that caused them to want to double check it just in case, even if they didn't think anything looked wrong at the outset. An example of a kind of case that the sheriff's office would flag for an administrative review is anytime a sheriff's deputy fires their service weapon at someone. Now, to their credit, and to be fair, it's required by law now in California, but still, to their credit, they proactively investigate each one of those cases and then refer a report to us at IOLERO, even if there is no complaint. And one of the things I think you're going to notice in this report is that those administrative reviews are actually really important in the IA investigations too. There are a number of kinds of cases. Oh, shoot, that should be 5. We actually had 5 administrative reviews, and they were of a variety of kinds. So 2 of them involved some shootings by deputies. 2 of them involved in custody deaths. And one of them involved a bite by a canine, meaning a police dog was used to bite somebody and caused a significant injury. None of those 5 cases are ones with regards to which there was a public complaint. So we were able to see those at IOLERO because Measure P, and this gets back to a question we asked earlier, like which cases come to IOLERO? Well, Measure P says cases about certain subjects come to IOLERO, and all the cases about which there is a complaint that went to IOLERO first. So if someone complains to IOLERO or the subject matter is one of the ones listed in Measure P, and there's quite a long list, then those come to IOLERO to audit. And I think that's particularly important because some of the situations that have the greatest impact on people in the community, like a deputy-involved shooting, often are not the subject of a complaint. But because of their high level of impact, I think it's appropriate that they still receive some oversight, and fortunately, Measure P provides that. So I hope that those in the public will think about that. It's important that IOLERO, in my opinion, it's important that IOLERO look not just at complaints from the public, but also events of significant consequence. So, you know, Robin, this is a question you were asking earlier, and hopefully that answers it. Some of the complaints that we get also end up being treated as what's called a grievance. That means that it's really about how people are being treated at the jail, not that some individual deputy mistreated them, but how are the conditions there generally? What's the quality of the food? How often do they get out of their cells? What's the quality of the programming at the jail? How well can they access, say, the internet when they're in the jail? How well can they make phone calls when they're in the jail? And those kinds of complaints are in California law described as a grievance. That's a technical term. And one reason there's a technical term for that is that state law requires the jail to resolve those grievances in a prompt way and to have a system for resolving them that includes a layer of appeal and in which a certain level of feedback is given to the people incarcerated at the jail to know that their grievance was handled correctly. And there's an opportunity for people at the jail to eventually sue about those grievances, but only if they've completed the grievance process first. So it's really important both in terms of tracking these kinds of concerns, making sure they're resolved in a thoughtful way, but also protecting the rights of inmates to eventually sue if they want to, that those kinds of concerns are put through the grievance process. So one of the things that we did this year is reach an agreement with the sheriff's office about how some of the complaints that come into IOLERO are classified as grievances and go through this jail system, and how others are continue to be classified as complaints about individual sheriff's deputies, and then are processed through the Internal Affairs Division, which will cause us to audit them down the pike. If we ever have disagreement about how a concern should be classified or how a part of a concern should be classified, then we have a process for having a conversation with the sheriff's office about that. And I will say one positive is that so far in this last year, we've been in agreement about how the different concerns that have come in should be processed, and we have not had arguments about that. And I think that's a positive. It tells us the sheriff's office is doing a good job of sorting these two kinds of concerns in an appropriate way. After these complaints, administrative reviews, or even IA investigations that are triggered by internal affairs, that qualify under Measure P to come back to IOLERO, once those cases come back to IOLERO, we then audit them. And that means, Matt and some of our other auditors comb through all the material that the sheriff's office put together about those cases, and they reach some opinions about it. I'll move real quick to what those opinions look like. The sheriff's office will, on any given allegation, find that it's sustained, meaning that some sheriff's deputy did something wrong, that it's exonerated, meaning the sheriff's deputies actually did the right thing according to policy, even if maybe the public disapproved or didn't like it. Unfounded, meaning it turns out that that thing that was alleged didn't happen. That's not uncommon when we have, say, third-party complaints or complaints from people who are, were not direct recipients of the thing that happened. They heard about it from someone else, or maybe they themselves didn't have opportunity to perceive it well. They were at a distance, or regrettably, in some cases, we do get complaints from people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time that they perceived the events, and so their perception wasn't accurate. And then finally, another category is that sometimes the cases are inconclusive. This is very rare, and we at IOLERO like to see that used only sparingly, because really the tools that are available for law enforcement to investigate these cases are such that we ought to be able to reach a conclusion about what happened and whether it was in policy most of the time. And I will say a positive for the sheriff's office is that we see this not sustained or inconclusive finding pretty rarely. And I think that's a sign of a healthy system. It's one sign of a healthy system. When we at IOLERO take a look at them, we might conclude that we agree with one of those four conclusions, we disagree with it, or that we think the investigation was incomplete. And we reach all of these conclusions individually based on what we think the individual allegation resulted in. So we might say have 3 allegations in a case. We might agree with the sheriff about one, disagree about another, and think the third one was investigated in an incomplete way. So Matt, do you think there's some other detail there, or anything I might have missed about this process that would be important to convey to the folks here on the meeting?
I think that pretty well covers it. Just the biggest takeaway is to understand that when we get the records that the sheriff office relied on in conducting its investigation and reaching its conclusion is what we look at as well. And so we do get to look at the 4 corners of what they looked at. So it is a second pair of eyes on it from beginning to end. So it's pretty comprehensive.
All right. Any other questions about this material? I see a couple other questions that are on slightly different topics that I'm going to get to as we go along, but I don't see any on this. All right, this is a spot where we're going to be able to answer a couple more of the questions that are already in the queue. We tried to organize the material in this report in a different way this time than we have in the past. And I want to give full credit to Matt for this. This was his idea, and I think it makes for a much easier read. And I think it also helps people understand the trends in these cases a lot better. So thank you, Matt, for coming up with this organizational scheme. The idea that Matt came up with was maybe we should organize the cases in this report according to the subject matter of the cases instead of going through them in some other way, say in chronological order or the like. You can see them grouped into cases of similar kind or like material. So these have been organized with all of the officer or deputy involved shootings at the beginning. And we did that in part because those tend to be cases about which there is the most public concern. We have another section that's about in custody deaths, because again, that's a topic of great concern. It happens that both of those were in custody and that the person who died was under the control of sheriff's deputies out in the field or being detained or arrested, but not at the jail. So none of these involve deaths at the jail. Another category that we separated out are PREA investigations. Now, PREA is an acronym for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And that's a federal statute that requires jails and prisons to investigate any allegation of sexual assault in a certain way. And we think that that is a positive because it creates a consistent expectation across all jail and prisons that those kinds of claims are going to be investigated, that they'll be investigated as a potential crime, and also as a potential failure of the jail or prison to keep the prisoner safe, that both of those issues are addressed. Now, PREA is a lot more complicated than that. We could do a whole nother, webinar about PREA and go on for maybe an hour or two about it. But we had 2 PREA claims, that is to say, people who were in the custody of the jail who alleged that they had been the victims of a sexual assault in one way or another. And we audited the investigations that the Sonoma County Internal Affairs Division did on those 2. I'm going to pause right here for a second because you'll see we've got parentheticals there behind those 3 categories. And the reason for that is that the officer-involved shootings and the in-custody deaths will in the future be the subject of independent investigations by IOLERO. In fact, we have independent investigations of those kinds going right now. They're just not completed, so you won't see them in this report. At the time that these cases happen, as you see from 2018 through 2020, that provision in Measure P wasn't law yet. And so we could not have done an independent investigation during those times. So instead, we did an audit of the style that we were describing earlier. And I think the reason that we have highlighted the shootings and the in-custody deaths in red here is because of that independent investigation power that you'll see in the future. So when you start seeing some of those cases in the future, there will be a more robust investigation by IOLERO instead of just an audit. I've also put here how often we agreed or disagreed on those cases. And so of these 3 kinds, the shootings, the in-custody deaths, and the PREA investigations, you'll see that we had a total of 6 cases in those 3 categories. And in 5 of those, IOLERO agreed with the conclusion the sheriff's office reached about the conduct in those 5 cases. I hope that that gives the community some confidence that the kinds of investigations that the sheriff's office did in these very high profile kinds of cases were on the whole pretty good, that they were reasonably thorough and that the conclusions they reached were objectively reasonable based on the work that we were doing, that matched at least what we think a reasonable person would conclude based on the evidence that was available as compared against the policies that existed at the time. There was one in custody death where we disagreed about the result, and that was one in which we felt that there was insufficient attention to the medical condition of someone who had been detained in a traffic stop. And he had very specifically complained that he was not well, that he had significant health issues, that he was feeling especially unwell during the course of the stop, that his condition was getting worse, that he needed medical attention. And regrettably, one of the deputies involved, who was also a field training officer, meaning responsible for training the other deputy who was with him, we thought responded in an inappropriate way and did not get medical treatment in time. Now, and by in time, I mean as promptly as policy required. We do not know that a prompter response would have changed the outcome. That is not knowable from the material that we have. But we were concerned that this particular field training officer was setting a poor example for the person he was training by not summoning the medical help. And so that's the one case about which we disagreed. And that's significant. But I think it's also, to be even-handed, fair to note that of these 6 cases, we thought the sheriff's office handled them appropriately in 5. Now, these are fairly dramatic kinds of cases. And so I think this might be a good place for us to pause for a moment. Matt, if you think there's some other things we should add about any of those cases, please feel free. And then we'll take a look and see if we have specific questions. I think we do have a question about one of them. Matt, anything else you think maybe we should add there before I move to some of the questions about those?
No, I think you covered them pretty well. I think that sums it up.
Okay. All right, great. I do notice we have a question in the chat from Jim Duffy about one of these cases. And Jim, your question is about a case in which you're asking, why did we or did we not look at a Sonoma County Sheriff's policy regarding positional asphyxia? And the reason that we didn't apply that policy in that particular case was that it was not in effect at the time of the events in that case. So that policy you're referring to in your question about positional asphyxia applies today. So if that case happened today, we would definitely be applying it. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the subject matter of this question, there is a growing body of evidence that the way a person is constrained by law enforcement if they're arrested or detained does have a significant effect on their ability to breathe. This might seem obvious, but it has become clearer over time that some of the positions in which you might put someone on the ground or in which you might hold on to a person that were thought to be fairly safe a few years ago turn out now with current medical understanding to be not so safe. So for example, if you look back 10 years ago, many law enforcement agencies were trained to hold a person down by, say, their shoulders or by their back if they were struggling or resisting. It is now generally the training, and it's also, I think, an accurate statement of current law in California, that when officers are going to restrain someone on the ground, they shouldn't put any pressure anywhere on their torso or even their stomach because of the way that the diaphragm works. So one of the things that the sheriff's office now does is train their deputies in a different way about how to restrain people. And I think that's a good thing. So that's a policy we're checking in the future. But for some of these older cases, didn't apply. I'm not seeing some other questions that are specific to these specific 6 cases. So I'll move to some of the other ones here. We also have in this annual report a set of cases in which the sheriff's office reviewed use of force in general used by a deputy. We also have some that are neglect of duty complaints, meaning a sheriff's deputy did not adequately investigate a case or maybe didn't make an arrest they should have made. We had a set of use of force complaints that we separated out. And I say use of force complaints separately from use of force reviews because these are ones where someone in the public actually expressed a concern about the use of force, as opposed to the sheriff's office checking it proactively. We had a set of cases about encounters with homeless persons, and in at least one of those cases, we found that there's a sheriff's deputy who did not comply with current practice in Sonoma County about referring people to services and treating them in a respectful and dignified way. We also had a set of claims that we organized in here. They're all about the jail. These are other than the two PREA investigations that we mentioned earlier. But when we look at the two PREA investigations and then these 5 jail claims, we see that in all 7 of those cases, IOLERO agreed with the sheriff's office about how they resolved those cases. There are a couple of bright points here. One is that we agreed with the sheriff's office that there were not sexual assaults that occurred in the 2 PREA cases. And in the other 5 jail claims, we generally concluded that the conduct of the deputies at the jail was in policy. So not only was the conduct correct in these 7 cases, but IOLERO and the sheriff's office agreed about that. So I hope that gives people at least a little bit more confidence about how things are going in the jail. Granted, that's only 7 specific incidents, but they were all the incidents that we looked at. I also want to say a positive that we've been seeing in terms of complaints about alleged misconduct of specific deputies in the jail is that recently the sheriff's office chose to assign a specific sheriff's deputy, a sergeant, over at the jail to do some of the investigations about claims that came from the jail. In the past, they would have someone at the Internal Affairs Division who might not have any experience with the jail in their career investigating cases about the jail. And we have, as a general rule, seen a significant improvement in the quality of the investigations coming out of complaints about the jail since that change was made and they assigned someone to do that work who's specifically from the jail. And I think that the sheriff's office deserves some credit for having done that. It was a thoughtful response, and it also seems to be creating a significant improvement in quality of the work. The final category we have is canine use of force. We're going to talk about trends that we see across several of these categories here in a minute. But before I do that, are there any other questions about the way we categorized these kinds of cases, or maybe about a specific case that anyone saw in the annual report? I see a question here that's kind of related. It's about grievances. This looks like it's from Leona Judson. And I think your question, Leona, is can grievances be submitted anonymously? I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I'm inclined to think one probably can't, given the way that system works. But Matt, do you have an understanding of the answer to that question?
My understanding is that it would not be anonymous. The grievance procedure is internal to the jail, and it's part of the administrative exhaustion process. It's kind of the gateway into getting to federal court if you choose to try to sue on a condition of confinement. And in order for them to process it, you have to write out the grievance, provide it to the staff, and it gets several layers of review, including possible hearing before the grievance officer there at the jail. So I'm not aware of any ability to do a grievance internally that would be anonymous.
You know, that matches my understanding too. One of the purposes of the grievance process is to resolve the issue for the specific inmate that's having the problem, and also to document that they were the one that made the ask or pointed out the problem, so that if they choose to sue later, they can show they went through the grievance process. If they can't show they went through the grievance process, they're not allowed to sue, at least not in federal court. So as a result of that, it's hard for me to imagine how it would work anonymously. I think it would probably have to be, you know, by name. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to show that that individual inmate actually protected their own rights. So great question, though. We might have to ask a little bit more around whether there's some other similar practice in other jails. But I suspect it would have to be by name. Thanks, Matt, for filling in on that. And then Another question we got was, do we see some retribution from jail staff about grievances? And I don't know that I have seen that happen, but that might be a good example of how a grievance and a complaint are different. So when someone actually complains, when someone makes a grievance, right, if they were then discriminated against in some way, they received some retribution, somebody did something bad to them, took something away from them in jail because they had grieved, we would look at that as a complaint about an individual deputy who did the retaliation, and then that would trigger an internal affairs investigation and an audit by IOLERO. So there is a process for resolving that, which we would take care of here at IOLERO. And then so there is a process for it, but I don't think I've actually seen such a case come through yet. I noticed there is also a question from Anna, and this was in Spanish, but I'll provide it in English because I know Ricardo is doing an answer here about, like, what are some of the differences between a grievance and a complaint. You know, some of the kinds of things we see in grievances are things like the quality of the food, amount of time out of the cell as opposed to being stuck in the cell has been the subject of a number of grievances. Sometimes access to reading material is one of the things that we see that comes up in grievances. Sometimes grievances relate to the quality of the time spent outside the cell, like how good is the space in which prisoners can exercise, the yard, they call it. And then part of the reason that that gets treated separately is that those kinds of issues are all systemic problems that are best cured by changing the operation of the jail overall for everybody. And that theoretically, if an inmate is able to grieve about something that really should be different for everybody at the jail, then a change can be made that would affect the entire jail. And that would be a benefit for all the other inmates too. So they tend to be issues that are broad, you know, as opposed to yesterday, a certain deputy spoke, you know, rudely to me. And I hope that helps people understand part of the distinction there. Matt, do you think I might have missed anything there about the difference between complaints and grievances and how they're treated?
No, they are distinct processes. A grievance, by definition under state regulation, applies to any condition of confinement. So that's pretty broad. And it can be anything dealing with changing the parameters of practices at the jail, although it's an individual based, like you pointed out, all the way down to I didn't get my mail, or you're not giving me my commissary materials at the right time. It can also include things such as use of force or improper conduct by a specific deputy. And the process actually does have some procedures there for that to actually bypass and go directly to higher authorities at the jail to review it. So it's pretty comprehensive. But if they're complaining, for example, that the grievance process itself has not been provided to them, I think that changes it to a whole different level of, you know, the grievance process is not made available. So that would be a clear example of a complaint. And I've seen where possibly even just claims of improper force used by a deputy would probably be sent over as a question of a complaint because of the nature of the conduct. So those are two examples that come to mind, but it's pretty broad, the grievance process under state law.
Okay, so next topic. We have some trends that we noticed in this annual report. If I can get, oh, there we go. Okay, so some of the trends that we'd like to discuss. Perhaps some of the people on the call here are going to see some other trends that you might point out to us at IOLERO, but these are the ones that we see. So first, as I mentioned earlier, we check to see whether we agree or disagree with a sheriff's office finding, or whether we think the investigation was incomplete. the number of times or the frequency with which we found that sheriff's investigations were incomplete went down a lot in this last fiscal year. And I think that's a significant improvement at the sheriff's office. So of the 27 investigations we summarized here, we found 6 were either complete or the investigation as to at least one of the allegations was incomplete, which we call partly incomplete. And that was only 22% of all of the cases we looked at had at least one incomplete allegation investigation. That's great as compared to the prior year where it was more than half. So in that regard, the sheriff's office investigative procedures have improved. Now, I'm still not going to say that a 22% incomplete rate is necessarily good. It's just better. So I want to make sure I'm clear about that. We would love to see a 0% incomplete rate because we think being complete is something that's entirely under the control of the IAD staff. And if all of the cases were complete, then IOLERO could actually opine about whether we agree or disagree about the findings reached on all those cases. So we're still pushing for a 100% complete rate, or to put it a different way, a 0% incomplete rate. But I do think the sheriff's office really deserves some credit for knocking that down in half. And if they keep going in that direction, hopefully they'll get to 0 soon. So one of the things that we did in this last fiscal year to try to help with that was write up some expectations that we had for the sheriff's office about what makes an investigation complete. And we did that for a couple reasons. One is that we think it's good practice as auditors to tell the people that we are auditing what the measuring stick is, what the rules are by which they're going to be judged or audited. That seems only fair. And so we want to make sure that we're getting across to the sheriff's office what we think it means to do a minimally complete report. And so they're not surprised when we say that something's incomplete. And they actually have a chance to take a look at the same checklist that we're looking at as they're working on the case to make sure it's complete. So we think that's fair, but it also provides them advanced knowledge about what to do so they can actually successfully complete the cases every time. It is not required by law or necessary that IOLERO and the sheriff's office agree about what it means to do a complete investigation. But in this case, we were able to reach an agreement about it. And I think that's also positive. That, I think, makes it more likely that sheriff's office personnel will buy into that checklist, will accept it in the future. It also, I think, creates greater confidence for the public that we're on the same page, that IOLERO and the sheriff's office are working well together. And I think it also means that in the future, when we find cases are not complete, that means something. It's not second guessing. It means the principles we set out in advance were not adhered to. So I suppose the downside for the sheriff's office might be in the future, if the cases are incomplete, there really isn't a lot of excuse for that, at least not that we anticipate. On the whole, I think this is a positive for the community. And so I'm glad that we got there. I anticipated we might have some questions about completeness, and I think I see at least one in our queue. Matt, is there something you might want to add about completeness? Do you think I covered it all there?
No, I think that's a good summary of it. I mean, completeness, as we laid out in the report, looks at how well they reviewed the case, how thorough they were in acquiring the information and documents, materials necessary to adequately review the issues. I think it's important to emphasize that not all cases are created equal. What is complete for one may not be complete for another, depending on the issue and how many are there, and whether it's an issue that's somewhat subservient or to the not directly at the core of the complaint. So it's something that requires a fairly robust review. But overall, I think that the trend is looking better, and the numbers reflect it.
Yeah. One of the questions we got, this is from Robin, is do the investigations that IOLERO flags as incomplete get sent back to the sheriff's office for further review. Well, Robin, I would say as a general rule, that's certainly an option that the sheriff's office would have, is that they could go back and do some more work. I've not seen them do that in the cases that we've worked on, but I will say that we have seen now several instances over the last year in which we saw that sheriff's office personnel who were reviewing the work before it came to us, so it's higher level managers, noted something that was incomplete and sent it back for more work. And we've seen that more in the last year than we used to. So I think while we're not seeing the sheriff's office go back and reinvestigate the cases that we flagged as incomplete that I know of, we have seen them proactively addressing incompleteness internally far more than they used to. And I think that's really to their credit. I have particularly noticed that over on the jail side. Remember, I mentioned earlier that they now have an investigator that's specific to jail claims of misconduct. And I think, at least in part, some of that's because IOLERO has been pointing out the incompleteness. And I appreciate the sheriff's office being proactive about it. Another question we have from Anna is, are the incomplete investigations a cause or a factor that impedes our completion of our work? And yeah, absolutely it is. One of the challenges that we have is that if there was, say, evidence gathered that we think should have been gathered, maybe an interview done of a particular person, and that didn't happen, it's really hard for us to understand then what really happened in the case. And sometimes the incompleteness prevents us from even figuring out if we agree or disagree with the result. One of the ways in which we've seen that the most in the last year are in the use of force cases, which I'll turn to here in a minute. But we have in a number of cases seen that officers who use force, who are then investigated about that use of force, haven't always been interviewed. A fair number of them just aren't interviewed at all by the sheriff's office historically. And we're seeing that practice change and improve. More often now, officers who use force and are then investigated are actually interviewed. And that's probably the primary way that incompleteness really negatively affects the work that we do. On some other occasions, we'll see a failure to gather evidence or a failure to preserve evidence, like a video, for example. And so, failure to preserve that kind of material hurts us too. So that's one of the many reasons why completeness is important. And we have laid out in our checklist specifically that issue, that we have to have, things like interviews and video captured. In the appendix to our report, we have a copy of the completeness checklist. So for those who want to go through it in some detail, you can take a look at that in our annual report. It's a public document. I'm going to turn now to another trend. As soon as my computer cooperates. There we go. Another one has to do with canine bites. And this is one of the most important, I think, trends that we have here in this report. We took a look at 3 different cases in which police dogs were used by sheriff's deputies to bite someone, and that caused some kind of injury. And in all 3 of those cases, we concluded that those bites were not consistent with policy. Or we found that there was some incompleteness in the investigation, and it looked likely that the bite was not consistent with policy. So our concern there is we saw a pattern, at least across those 3 cases, of a policy and a practice at the sheriff's office that we think didn't comply with current law. And the 2 ways in which we think we saw a disconnect there were that federal law requires what's called an immediate threat of violence or injury to someone at the scene to use a dog to create this level of injury. So in other words, if a sheriff's deputy uses a dog to inflict an injury on someone that's significant, where we're talking about breaking skin or tearing muscle or causing some kind of disfiguring wound, or one that makes a person less able to use a certain part of their body for a certain period of time, that really there has to have been some kind of immediate threat that someone else was going to be injured. So the classic examples are suspects or subjects who are holding a knife and won't drop it, or are known to have already, suspected to have already committed a violent crime, like armed robbery, and are now hiding and won't come out, such that if a police officer tried to get close to them, they might get hurt or injured. And what we've been noticing is that in these three cases, we didn't see an ability to articulate that immediacy by the deputies who used the dogs. In addition to that, a separate issue is that California law now requires that when sheriff's deputies or police officers use force, they consider how they can de-escalate the case. That is, bring the level of tension in the situation down so that force isn't necessary. And they have to be able to show that the amount of force they use was proportionate to the resistance or the threat of violence that they received on the other end from the person they were trying to stop. And we didn't see these issues really articulated either at all or well by the sheriff's deputies involved in these three cases, and not analyzed by internal affairs. That's a significant concern. So one of the things that we have asked and recommended is that the sheriff's office re-examine their policies for legal compliance, also reassess their training in that same regard. And then finally, they want to figure out, we want them to figure out whether that policy actually matches public expectation, which is an entirely different question than whether it's lawful. And we say that because from our perspective, we think that the public tends to be very concerned about how police dogs are used, because historically in our country, they tend to be used disproportionately against people of color and in situations that cause intense fear. And it's a use of force that causes, at least can cause in many instances, really significant injury. And so making sure we're doing that in a way that matches up to public expectation, we think is important for every law enforcement agency, right? So to their credit, we know that the sheriff's office has had a study done just recently about their canine policy and training, and we're hopeful we get to take a look at that shortly and can see what that looks like and learn what changes they might want to make around their canine process. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this trend might be changed in the near future by revision to that policy and training. So, fingers crossed. I am glad at least the sheriff's office was listening about this issue and is looking into what changes they can make. I think the canine issue is an important one, so I want to pause real quick and see if we have any questions specific about that issue. I'm not seeing any pop up, so I think maybe hopefully I said enough. Matt, I know you worked really hard on all three of these canine cases, and I thought your work was really stellar. Is there anything else that you want to add on these three?
No, I don't think so. Canines are a unique area involving the use of force. They're not a static instrument like a baton or a taser. When a canine is released off leash to apprehend, you lose physical control. So it's materially different than, say, firearm or a taser, where the officer retains directional control, at least to a substantial degree. So it's a very unique manner or method for using force that creates some different problems. And so that was one of the issues raised both in the policies and in the audits, is that particular aspect of it. So that's something that should be considered as people think about the questions regarding the use of canines, is that unique element.
I think that's a really good point, Matt. And if it wasn't obvious from my comment earlier, I think IOLERO's ability to flag this issue and effectively analyze these canine cases is almost entirely due to Matt's really hard work on this topic. And I really appreciate that, Matt. That was fantastic work that you did there. I should mention to people too that earlier in this presentation, I talked about how some of our cases are ones where you can see more detail on our website. These canine cases are among those. So if you go to our website, we have a section that talks about our prior audits, and you can actually read the entire audits in these 3 cases. And then we also have links there that go over to our the material that we have at the sheriff's office about those same cases. So you can see some of the body worn camera and the like in some of those cases. So that's a level of transparency that historically we didn't have here in Sonoma County, and that honestly not many people had in many places in California. So for those of you who are concerned about how police canines are being used, you want to know more about that, we've got lots more material for you to read. And in fact, I'll screen share real briefly with you where you can find some of that material. Okay, so you should be able, was that Matt, did I get this right? You should be able to see our IOLERO website here. Okay, good. So one of the tabs down here is audit reports. If you click on that, you'll see here that we have a description of some of the ways that the law has changed, allows us to do that. And you'll see here the specific cases listed. And so in addition to the dog cases, you can find a few others. And if you go to one of them, I'll click on this one, for example, you can go straight over to our audit. This is the same document that we send over to the sheriff's office when we're done. There are a few redactions that are required by law, but other than that, most of it's there. And then you can also use these links to see the sheriff's response to the audit, what they thought about our audit. And if you click these links that say sheriff's file, you can pop over to a website that the sheriff's office keeps, which is conveniently got a Dropbox folder that's got all the audio and video recordings from the incident, including body worn camera, some redacted photos, the incident reports written by the deputies at the scene, and the full internal affairs evaluation of the case. So I commend those to your reading. I'm going to show you one other page here. If you want to see the sheriff's office parallel page, it's simply called sonomaSheriff.org/SB1421. SB1421 is a reference to one of the changes in law that made this possible. And here you can see all of the cases that they have available. And there's quite a bit of material in there to their credit. And they're constantly posting more material to this. So anytime you are curious, you can pop over there and see some more new cases that they have there. So lots of information available there if you are interested in it. Okay. Hopefully you're back on our PowerPoint, right? Okay, good. All right, so another conclusion we reached in our trends were that the use of force investigations could be more robust at the Internal Affairs Division. I mentioned to you earlier that it was not uncommon that sometimes sheriff's deputies were not interviewed. In a small number of the use of force cases, there's a parallel criminal investigation that went on about the sheriff's deputies' use of force. That usually happens where there's a fatality or a shooting. So the deputy shootings or deaths in the jail or deaths in custody, to their credit, the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office will bring in some other law enforcement agency to see if that sheriff's deputy committed a crime. And those sheriff's deputies will often be interviewed there. But there's a whole different set of questions that are asked and a different set of rules about what questions are okay to ask in that kind of interview. So we still feel strongly that in addition to that interview, the sheriff's deputy should be interviewed over at the sheriff's office by Internal Affairs Division personnel to see if they violate any department policies. And in many cases, there's no criminal investigation, say a lower level of use of force like those dog bite cases I mentioned earlier. And in those, we think also there needs to be an interview by Internal Affairs. So that's the biggest reason we see these incomplete cases. And in fact, 2 of the 3 canine cases I talked about earlier had at least some portion that we thought was incomplete. Of the 6 incomplete findings that we saw across all of the sheriff's office cases, 4 of them had to do with use of force cases. So this is the place where we think investigations really do need to be more robust. And you'll see in our completeness checklist that many of the items we have in there relate to how use of force cases in particular are investigated, and how some of those factors I mentioned earlier, like de-escalation and proportionality, are assessed. So hopefully we'll see some improvement there. Another couple set of trends we saw were about social media postings. I think Matt deserves the lion's share of credit for this. He noted that some of the past social media postings and also what you might call video snippets, that the sheriff's office would put together in prior years. So we're talking, say, 2022, 2021, 2020 under prior administration, where sometimes later it turns out not entirely accurate or complete. And so sometimes those would be Facebook posts, sometimes those would be produced videos that the sheriff's office had put together either themselves or with vendors. And we've encouraged them to still make statements to the public about what's happening. We think that transparency is good, but use greater caution about the contents. And we have noticed that at least this calendar year, those have improved, and we're glad to see that. And I want to thank Matt for pointing out that problem. If a sheriff's office puts out a statement about an event that later turns out to be incorrect, that undercuts everyone's sense of confidence. And I think it's better to take a beat to make sure the information is really fully accurate and well developed before it's released. Another issue we saw was timeliness. A lot of cases that we got back, 18% of them got to IOLERO after the deadline for the legal deadline in state law for the sheriff's office to take some kind of action on the case. That's normally 1 year. There are many exceptions. So sometimes people, sheriff's offices have more time to do that than a year, particularly the shooting cases are like that. And then that said, if the sheriff's office gets the audit or their investigation to us for audit after it's too late for them to take any action, then our audit doesn't inform them about how they could change their approach to the case, right? It's just too late. It's past the statute of limitations. And so we think it's better practice for the sheriff's office to get those investigations to us before that 1 year deadline passes. Now, I think it is also true, and some will note that I don't think at IOLERO we have any evidence of any sheriff's office investigations being changed or their conclusions being altered as a result of an IOLERO audit. That is, of course, up to the sheriff's office. We can try to persuade them to change some of their cases, but they might not. That said, we still think it's best practice to at least get those cases to IOLERO in time for us to try to convince the sheriff's office to change their position, rather than making the audit effectively a dead letter or 2020 hindsight critique instead of being an active partner in trying to improve the approach. So hopefully we see that change. We're working now on some timeliness criteria, and if we're able to get those promulgated, preferably with some agreement with the sheriff's office about them, that I think would be a help. Any other questions about trends? I think I might see a couple here in the queue. One is from Robin, and it's, to what extent does the SCSO work in conjunction with the DA in determining criminality? And so, Robin, I'm going to assume that you mean there whether or not a sheriff's deputy committed a crime. And one of the things that the Sonoma County system does altogether is make sure that if there's an allegation that a sheriff's deputy in Sonoma County has committed a crime, that it's not, as a general rule, the sheriff's office that's investigating that case. And that also means that they're generally not working with the DA to figure out whether a crime was committed. And that's not because the sheriff's office wouldn't be concerned about it, but actually because they're deeply concerned about it and want to make sure that they have some objectivity at hand and some independence at hand by having some other law enforcement agency investigate it. So that way there's no allegation that the sheriff's office buried the case or didn't investigate it thoroughly. A lot of the time that's the Santa Rosa Police Department, but it can be other agencies too. And there are some limited circumstances in which the state attorney general can get involved in those cases. As far as we can tell, it looks like the sheriff's office cooperation with those other investigations seems to be good. We don't have any reason to think that they're not making people available or not providing material that those criminal investigators might need. So I think the short answer to your question is the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office don't work together on figuring out whether or not sheriff's deputies have committed a crime, just to make sure that those investigations are independent. Another question we have from an anonymous attendee is IOLERO investigating active sheriff's deputies who post and believe in right-wing conspiracy theories? Our current scope of authority doesn't give us the authority under Measure P to directly investigate those kinds of claims. That's something where the CAC, the Community Advisory Council, has been having some conversation with the sheriff's office about ways the sheriff's office can create some policies to try to root out deputies like that. But it is not a kind of allegation that IOLERO is permitted to directly investigate. And then another question from the anonymous attendee is whether IOLERO investigates behavior that occurs at say, a union hall or the like. I don't believe we received any complaints about that to pass on to internal affairs to investigate, and we wouldn't have the authority to directly investigate that kind of behavior under Measure P. I hope that answers that question, although the particular examples in that question do sound like they're of concern. All right, so a few other positive changes we saw this year. If I can get my slide to advance, there it is. I mentioned the agreements we reached with the sheriff's office about completeness and also how we distinguish grievances from complaints, and I think those are both significant positives. The completeness rate we talked about and the jail investigation complete improvements we talked about. There are also some new sheriff's office policies over the last year that we thought were helpful. We had flagged in a couple of our cases that from our perspective, it's not best practice. It's not appropriate to have a low-ranking officer at the sheriff's office assigned to investigate alleged misconduct by a high-ranking member of the sheriff's office, like the sheriff themselves or an assistant sheriff. And that, in a paramilitary organization like a sheriff's office, it's just too intimidating for those lower level investigators to have to investigate one of their superiors. And it creates the potential that they're not going to feel empowered to really go wherever the evidence leads. So we were pleased to see that after we made some recommendations about that issue, the sheriff's office adopted a new policy that they'll find an outside investigator for cases like that. I think that's great. We also had a case, someone asked earlier, what's conduct unbecoming? Well, it's a pretty general term, but one example would be, we had a case in which it was alleged that some members of the sheriff's office had been wearing their official uniforms while they were in photographs or videos used on a political campaign. And that came in as a complaint. The sheriff's office investigated it, and then we audited that matter. That's one of the audits in this report. And we concluded at the end of that the sheriff's office past practices and understanding about the rules that related to use of uniforms there didn't match state and federal law, which from our perspective pretty clearly prohibited using those uniforms in any way in those kinds of ads. And so the sheriff's office revised their policies to match state and federal law. So now sheriff's deputies explicitly know that they can't use those uniforms in those kinds of political ads. So we're glad to see that. That's an improvement too. We also saw an improvement in a portion of the use of force policies that have to do with how officers use pain compliance, right? They might put pressure on a part of the body to get someone to comply when they're resisting arrest or resisting a detention. And so we were glad to see that change too. Another category of positive change we saw this last year was that the sheriff's office cooperation with the Community Advisory Council improved in some specific ways. One of them was that we had an annual retreat back in February, and I suspect we'll do another one probably in the coming year with the CAC members so they could set priorities for their work over this course of this year. And the sheriff participated in that retreat, which I thought was great. He actually came and talked with us for about an hour, and I really appreciated his time with us. We also started seeing, written or even sometimes verbal, responses from the sheriff's office to some of the policy recommendations that the CAC made. And in that regard, I know the sheriff has made himself available for meetings with some of the CAC members about specific policy recommendations, and I really appreciated that too. That's a level of collaboration we haven't seen in the past. And then, oh, shoot, got one slide that wasn't complete there. I'm gonna have to give myself an incomplete for this slide. So the SCSO's, cooperation, generally with the CAC's ad hoc committees where they're trying to learn more about sheriff's office policies and training was also very good. And several of the CAC members had opportunity to show up at trainings or to be able to talk to experts in the sheriff's office about things that they needed. So I appreciated that too. And those are all some significant improvements. We have a question in the chat about whether there are some open CAC positions. And, I know we do have one vacancy in the 5th district. That's the West County, Linda Hopkins district. And we have a series of people being appointed to the CAC this month and next month by the Board of Supervisors. Off the top of my head, Lizette, I think that 5th district vacancy might be the only one we have left. Does that sound right to you?
Correct.
All right, there you go. So we have one in the 5th district. So moving forward, we have a variety of other things we're looking at over this next year. We have a lot more to do on building out some of the powers and duties that we have under Measure P. Hopefully in our next annual report, you'll see some more about some of the other provisions of Measure P that we didn't get to in this last fiscal year, like how we audit certain kinds of civil claims against the county, the whistleblower program where we accept complaints from county employees about things that might have happened to the sheriff's office and investigate those directly instead of sending them for audit. And more about other kinds of independent investigations. As I mentioned, we have some in the pipeline, and as those are completed, hopefully some of those will be done in time for the next annual report. We're working on a lot of new IOLERO investigative resources. We're working on creating an interview room here at the IOLERO offices, so we have a secure and appropriate place to do those independent investigations, at least the interviews for them. And we're getting pretty close to being able to launch a case management database program, which we've never had in the past, and hopefully allows us to stay on top of the significant case flow we have and also answer questions like the one from Kim Clement about the racial demographics of the people who've made complaints, which I think is a great question. We're also working on completing at least the first iteration of an IOLERO internal policies and procedures manual, so you all understand better what we're doing, so it's transparent to the public. I don't believe we've had one in the past, and now that we have a larger staff than we used to, we're going to try to make that happen. And as I mentioned earlier, working on timeliness guidelines and some similar tools for measuring and routinizing our work. So hopefully you'll see a lot more about all those topics in our next annual report. I will say that's a lot for us to do in the next year, even with the increased staff we have under Measure P. So we are finding that with the increased caseload of audits and all these tasks, it's a lot. So if there are folks out there who were looking for us to take on, anything new above and beyond Measure P, this probably isn't the year, but I am really excited about all the things that Measure P allows us and requires us to do. So thank you, Sonoma County, for supporting Measure P and giving us those opportunities. And that's everything that we had for tonight. If there are other questions or comments that people want to post in the Q&A, please do. I see a big thank you from Jim Duffy. Jim, you're welcome. And if anybody maybe wants to raise a hand, we could try to get to you too now that we are at the end. Lizette, are you in a place where you are able to give attendees who are raising their hand the opportunity to talk in case any of them want to chat real quick? I forget if we set
Yes,
this
I
up.
don't see anyone raising their hand. Oh,
Yeah.
right, we have one now.
Ah, okay.
Two. Okay.
Buenas noches,
Buenas noches, Ana.
soy Ana. Tuve problemas conectándome con traducción. Otra cosa que quería preguntar es que mientras escuchaba el reporte, me di cuenta de que hay mucho del lenguaje que se usa aquí. Nuestra comunidad no está familiarizado con eso. Entonces, es muy difícil para uno seguir o hacer un reporte. Precisamente yo que tengo un poco de tiempo siguiendo estas reuniones, me he encontrado con algunas palabras que yo no soy tan familiarizada con ellos. Por eso es que yo hago el comentario de que nos sensibilicemos más con la cultura latina, y que también nos eduquemos juntos, ¿verdad? Tanto ustedes como nosotros, para que haya esa fluidez de confianza y de lenguaje también. Gracias.
Gracias.
For those who are listening, I think Anna makes a good point, which is that some of the language that we use when we're talking about these topics, I think we are still struggling to figure out how best to translate them into Spanish. Some of the concepts we talk about here are difficult even in English because they're very technical, very legal, and they tend to have very specific meanings. And, you know, one of the things that Lizette and Ricardo and I have talked about on several occasions is how best can we translate some of these, some of the vocabulary into Spanish in a way that still conveys the meaning well. And I think we are still trying to figure that out. Like as an example, there are a couple different words we've come across that we could use to translate sheriff, right, into Spanish. And we get different responses from different Spanish speakers about which one is best. So I really appreciate you raising that issue, Anna. And you know, we've also been working on different ways to provide translation in these meetings. And maybe we could find an opportunity for me and Lizette and Ricardo to talk to you for a little bit more, you know, offline about ways we could improve some of this material so it's more accessible. So you know, thank you for raising that concern. And then I see Lucero Hernandez here. Let me see if I can get to you. I see Lizette had to step away for just a sec, so I am going to try to make sure I'm operating Zoom correctly to get Lucero in here. Okay, Lucero, go ahead. If you'll need to unmute on your end. There you go.
Gracias por darme la oportunidad. Yo soy Lucero Hernández y mi comentario es que hoy en día hay una preocupación en la comunidad en las escuelas públicas, sobre servicios para niños, estudiantes con una IEP. ¿Es posible que ustedes puedan ayudar, apoyar a investigar qué es lo que está pasando en el sistema? He estado en el distrito de Santa Rosa desde 2005 y tuve 2 hijas, ¿verdad? 2 hijastras fueron a la escuela. Tristemente no lograron graduarse y aquel entonces la información, falta de información, de mucho conocimiento, no pude, no estaba preparada para poder abogar por ellas. Ah,
Mhm.
Hoy en día, mi hijo, tengo dos hijos, una jovencita de 14, otro joven de 17 años. Empecé con una IP desde el 2015, por la razón que mi hijo estaba presentando demasiados comportamientos, la cual yo no entendía por qué, pero muy preocupantes, ¿verdad? A mi hijo, yo no conocía nada del autismo, ADHD, aprendizaje intelectual, discapacidad de aprendizaje. Y la vida me ha puesto una tarea muy grande, pero es un tema muy preocupante en la comunidad.
Well, Lucero, I understand your concern. I have 2 teenage boys too, and that's hard enough. And if you also have them on an IEP, need some additional services, that's really a tough place to be. We don't at IOLERO have any oversight over the Santa Rosa schools or any of the other schools locally. Though, that said, here in Sonoma County, there's an Office of Equity, and it happens that the person who runs that, Alegria de la Cruz, is also a member of the Santa Rosa School Board. And so perhaps if you can give some contact information through Lizette or Ricardo, and we might be able to get you in touch with at least her, and maybe that would be a place to start. I'm sorry that we don't have the ability to do something more direct. It's just we don't have any skills here about schools, but my heart goes out to you. It sounds very challenging. And Ricardo, thank you in advance for your translation work too. Are there any other questions we might have? All right, well, I think that's it then for our town hall. And look, we're 15 minutes early, so I think we did something right. I appreciate everybody bearing with us as we had a couple little technical challenges there. And as we're trying to experiment with this, I want to thank Lizette and Matt for both being here. And really appreciated both of your time. And Ricardo, thank you for the translation. And again, for all the awesome graphic design. The graphic design you saw in that PowerPoint was all Ricardo too. So please do get us some feedback, either call or email, or let us know what you thought of this town hall and whether you think maybe we could do it differently or better next year. All right. So thanks again for all your time. Thanks for your input. Thanks for the questions. And we'll talk to you again soon.